So we're going to talk about probably one of the most foundational concepts in all of political science, the concept of power, and thinking about that in terms of international politics and how that works. So if we're just looking for a quick and dirty definition of power, we might go with the ability to influence. Which I think is sort of the shorthand definition that most political scientists use. We might expand that a little bit. Power is the ability to make someone do something that they otherwise wouldn't do, and probably don't want to, right? So there's this element of controlling others. We'll talk about that in a little bit. But that's a really abstract sort of thing, right? I mean, control over others is something that we kind of have a concept of, but would be really hard to measure. And so oftentimes in international politics, we just sort of make this assumption that the power that a state has is really just correlated or maybe interchangeable or measurable through the capabilities, the tangible assets that a state has that they can bring to bear on a particular problem. And oftentimes we sort of make the assumption that these resources, these assets, these capabilities are fungible, that it's just this pool that can be spent on anything at any moment in time on anything that we want. And that's a useful sort of heuristic, but we're going to talk about some of the ways that maybe thinking about power in terms of things that we can count or measure, or this pool of resources is maybe incorrect, or doesn't quite get us where we want to go. If we are thinking about power in terms of resources, we might end up with a distribution of power in the international system that looks something like this, with the dark green being the most powerful states and the sort of pale green being the least powerful states. This is a measure that was developed by the Correlates of War Project. It's their composite index of national material capabilities. It's basically a rough estimate for if you had to fight World War II again, a total war, and mobilize your economy and your population, your military, your steel production, your electricity production, how many resources could you bring to bear? And it's not particularly surprising. The United States ends up being one of the most powerful states, China being another, India and Russia kind of in another tier, and then a number of European states sort of having significant power as well. But again, counting in terms of the population size you have, or the size of your economy or military budget, really doesn't do us a whole lot of good, because if we go back to that original definition, power is the ability to get somebody else to change their behavior. And that needs to be taken into consideration of the resources that they have. And so the capabilities that you have need to be put into context. If you have 10 tanks, is that a lot of tanks? Well, it depends how many tanks your opponent has. If your opponent has 100 tanks, then no, your 10 tanks is not a particularly impressive set of capabilities in terms of projecting power, in terms of being able to cajole them into changing their behavior. And so because of that, because we have to think about our power relative to the capabilities that others have, realists in particular, but I think in general, there's an element of power as zero sum. That is, I gain resources that I can spend in terms of power, that reduces the power available to others to change behavior using their resources, because of that element of relativeness of power. The other sort of thing I'd maybe flag is that while we oftentimes make the assumption that the capabilities that a state has can be used in any particular situation to solve any particular problem, that's not actually true. That the capabilities are not all that fungible. And this is something that was discovered by the Eisenhower, well, it was discovered well before that, but it was prominently discovered by the Eisenhower administration after World War I, when the United States had nuclear weapons, and Eisenhower was hoping to rely less upon conventional military force, because the United States had the bomb, which was an incredibly powerful weapon, and in terms of capabilities, is sort of off the charts. But the Eisenhower administration encountered a whole host of problems, from Lebanon to Guatemala, where it wanted to get states to change behavior. It wanted to use power and apply power to situations, and it found that nuclear weapons were just not the right tool. And so in Guatemala, the catalyst was that the government was nationalizing the plantations of United Fruit Co. And the Eisenhower administration wanted them to stop and wanted to protect, banana plantations. But nobody nukes country over banana plantations. There's just a mismatch in terms of when you can actually use certain kinds of power, when they're going to actually be effective. And I think that's important to keep in mind when we're thinking about how we're going to measure power and the kind of things that we might count, that the things that we count may or may not be useful for a particular problem. We should also talk about the kind of behavior that you're trying to change. And this is a distinction that comes from Tom Schelling, where he notes that it may actually take a heck of a lot more resources and power and capabilities to try to compel someone to take a particular action, right? To stand over them and say, you must do this, and I'm going to make you do that. That's a lot of labor, a lot of resources required to do that kind of task. And if that's the kind of task that you're going to do, you're probably going to need a heck of a lot more resources, whereas deterrence is potentially easier. Deterrence is preventing others from doing something, oftentimes by creating a credible threat. If you take this action and cross this particular line or something that I can observe, there will be consequences, and this is what those consequences will look like. I'll give you an example of this compellence deterrence sort of puzzle in action. During the Obama administration, there was an effort to reduce North Korean weapons proliferation. North Korea was exporting missiles, and the Obama administration was sending out the Navy to kind of track North Korean ships that had missile parts inbound, and they wanted to intercept these ships and, seize missiles that were headed toward, states that were potentially dangerous to the United States. But North Korea was very clear, using deterrence, if you board our ships, that will be a declaration of war, and we'll, attack South Korea, right? That was a very effective deterrence. The United States is much more powerful than North Korea, but that deterrent effect was able to hold the United States off. So the United States, trying to achieve compellence to prevent North Korea from exporting weapons, struggled and was able to kind of turn the puzzle around. That as North Korean ships would approach a port, the U.S. Navy would radio ahead and say, there is a North Korean ship that we believe has, missiles on board that they're going to proliferate, and we would like you to deny the ship the ability to dock. And the United States was applying pressure on these other countries, but in a very specific way. Like, there's an observable thing. If you allow that ship to dock, these are the consequences that will follow from that, sort of flipping that idea of deterrence around. And eventually the North Korean ships sort of discovered that there was no place for them to refuel, there was no place for them to restock on water, and they had to turn back because there wasn't a place to be able to put into port. So thinking about what we're actually trying to achieve and whether we're trying to achieve that by standing over somebody and making them do it versus trying to deter them can really change the nature of that power dynamic. This maybe gets us into this idea of carrots and sticks. It's an age-old metaphor around donkeys and how to get donkeys to move. Apparently donkeys are stubborn creatures, and you can either entice the donkey with a carrot. Carrots are something that donkeys like, and you sort of hold the carrot out and say, if you move, if you do this thing that I want, you'll get this reward, you'll get this thing that I will give you that makes moving more enticing, right? And so carrots are very effective at getting people to change behavior by making the thing that we want to have happen look appealing, right? This is essentially a bribe. But bribes work, right? I mean, people get paid for jobs, people get paid to do things all the time. That's a very reliable form of human interaction. However, in international politics, when you're trying to prevent somebody from doing something that you don't like, you may be hesitant to bribe them for fear that they'll maybe act out in the future, right? And so this is commonly, again, applied to North Korea, where in the 1990s, North Korea was developing uranium fuel at a nuclear reactor that was being enriched toward weapons grade, and the United States basically cut a deal, bribed North Korea, offered a carrot, stop producing your highly enriched uranium at this site, and we will give you food and fuel and fertilizer, the three things that North Korea desperately needed at that particular point. And North Korea took the fertilizer, shut down the plant, and then a couple years later, it was discovered that they had started a new nuclear facility where they were building nuclear fissile material using plutonium. Different process, different method, different facility, but clearly in violation. And there was the assumption that the United States would sit down and negotiate and pay North Korea off again. So maybe you don't want to necessarily use the carrot, because you may find yourself paying that bribe multiple times. The other way to think about how to cajole somebody into changing their behavior, going back to our donkey metaphor, right? You can pick up a stick. You can shake the stick menacingly. Maybe the donkey will say, I don't want to, stand here. It looks like I might get hit. You might hit the donkey with our metaphor of how do you motivate a change in behavior. And what you're essentially doing is you're saying the behavior that you want to sustain, not moving, is going to become painful. It's going to become undesirable. And you may discover that you actually prefer the behavior that I'm trying to incentivize, because I'm disincentivizing the behavior you prefer. One of the nice things about using the stick or coercion is that it's oftentimes preempted by a threat. And if that threat is successful, then you don't have to do anything, right? You essentially get something for free, right? But threats aren't always successful. That threat may not be viewed as credible. It may not be understood. And as a consequence of that, you may find yourself in a situation where you have to follow through on the threat. And in the context of military force in the international system, that can be very expensive. It costed the United States about $1 million a year for every soldier it had stationed in Afghanistan. Cruise missiles run a little over $1 million a piece. Military force is incredibly expensive, and oftentimes, if not always, fails to make any sort of financial cost-benefit calculation. And so simply willy-nilly issuing threats may not be the best strategy to get what you want in the international system. I'm going to pivot a little bit, because what we've been talking about with carrots and sticks is really a story about what we call hard power, using the capabilities that you have to try to change behavior of others. And certainly that's part of international politics and part of how power operates, but it's probably not the only way that power operates. And so Joseph Nye put forward this idea a number of years ago of soft power, and in which he said that the whole story of donkeys and carrots and sticks and control over others isn't the only way that power can work, right? If we shift our thinking from how do I control someone's behavior to how do I get the outcomes that I want, we can still think about how to achieve our goals in a way that doesn't require carrots and sticks, hard power, controlling others, spending resources, and may not actually even be zero sum. And so this idea of soft power gets put forward in a couple different ways. It's used casually in everyday conversation, really just to mean that people like you, which I don't think is what Joseph Nye was necessarily arguing, and I think is actually too narrow a way of thinking about soft power. But that's part of it, right? Part of soft power is getting others to look at you and admire what you're doing and desire to do the kind of things that you think are good, the kind of things that you are doing. And so this oftentimes gets put forward in the idea that, democratic systems tend to be more successful, and that creates an appeal toward democratic systems, and that the countries that are more open tend to be more successful economically, and that maybe encourages openness. And if that's something that you want to encourage in other states, then being a successful model of that working may actually be an appeal that would get you to get others to move in the direction that you think is good for them and potentially for you. But I actually don't think that that's the most useful way to think about this idea of shifting from power over others to power over outcomes. I think a much better illustration of this shift in thinking could be seen in terms of controlling and dominating the agenda. right? To control what gets discussed, to control the rules of an organization, to control the framing of issues. And so when my kids were little, I would oftentimes, incentivize, or I wouldn't incentivize them. I would control their decision process over going to bed. I would say, before you go to bed, would you like a cookie or an apple? And they'd say, I want the cookie. And then they go to bed. I didn't give them a choice about where they would end up, but I was able to control and frame their choice in such a way that they took the path they wanted that led to the place that I wanted them to go, to bed. So being able to control that choice process, being able to set the agenda ends up being really important in organizations, because you can push forward the kind of things that you think need to be dealt with, that you think need to be talked about. You can keep bringing them up if you don't get the result you liked last time, and things that you don't want to talk about and you don't think should be changed stay off the agenda. Or they get put at the end, and you never get to that end of the agenda item, and so they get rolled on to the next agenda, and they stay there for years. You're not controlling anyone. You're using carrots or sticks in that situation. You're not even spending power. You're just using the position you hold within an institution, the ability to write the agenda, to dictate, manage, ensure, we'll go with ensure, that the outcomes that you want are the outcomes that occur. And so when we're thinking about power, I think it's useful to have the story of carrots and sticks in the back of your mind, but that's not the only story about how power operates. And this idea of soft power can maybe help us to see situations in which we're able to use our positions, our ability to block things, the rules within an organization, to be able to get the things that we want through that process rather than by controlling others.